Well, there is actually a short title of this talk called A Home for the Wandering Jew, but it is about how Ireland was proposed to be a home for the Jewish people. It failed, and how our very own Irish novelist Maria Edgeworth picked this up and used it in a novel. So, by the way, we're interactive. I expect audience participation.
When you get started.
And including, should you wish to interrupt me, as long as it's verbally and not with rotten eggs or anything. Okay, so I have a question for you all. What does the word home imply? What does it mean to you, apart from warm fuzzies and board pneumona peat fires, something more universal? If you hear the word home, what words would you use? What would it evoke for you?
Security.
Great, that's one of mine, thank you. Okay, another one?
Somewhere where you belong to.
Absolutely, thank you. Very, very good. Okay, any more?
Family.
Family. Okay. One more?
Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Hilary. Yes, that's a very important one. Great. And to those, I would only add stability, permanence, connectedness to community, and contributing to society. So in the first part of this talk, I'll be looking at how Ireland could have become home to the wandering Jew. Not British Uganda, or British Guiana, or what I discovered, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in the USSR, or Madagascar, which was a plan of Himmler, but our own Ireland. Now, James Harrington, who proposed this, was a minor aristocrat. He was a baronet and lived in the middle 17th century. And through his extended family, he was related to virtually everyone who was anyone in the British aristocracy. He had the usual background: private education, Oxford, grand tour, including the court of Prince William of Orange, and he went to Rome, where he attended a very strange ceremony, which involved the Pope consecrating some wax objects. Now, whether they were candles or tapers, I don't know. At any rate, what you had to do to get your party bag and take one of these home was to kiss the Pope's toe. He refused. He got back to England, went to the court of Charles I, where he was welcome. The king already knew about this, and he said, you know, really, I think you made a mistake, because all you needed to do was pay the normal respect that you would owe to any secular prince. And very quickly, Harrington replied, "Having already kissed your hand, Your Majesty, I had no desire to kiss the foot of a minor prince." So he and Charles became great friends. Okay. Now, James is not only a good conversationalist, generous to family and friends, but a serious political theorist, up there with Hobbes and Locke, who, upon the execution of his friend, Charles, in 1649, retired to his study to write his political treatise, Oceana, which describes a utopian English republic. The context in which James was thinking and writing was one of extreme chaos during more than 10 years, from 1639 to 1652. In 1639 and 40, Scotland invaded England seeking religious concessions because of the publication of a prayer book that was being foisted onto them. This eventually paved the way for a rebellion in 1641 by Catholic Ireland, taking her usual advantage of English weakness to revolt. You know the expression, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. This was very much the case. So the king and parliament wrangled over who was going to control the army in crushing rebellion, leading to the outbreak of civil war in 1642. Cromwell didn't finish the reconquest of Ireland until the fall of Galway in 1652, as he was also fighting Charles II of Scotland. By the end of all this, there were more than 200,000 dead, including Scots and many Irish. The very foundations of British society were shaken. War with vast destruction of private property, hunger, the anxiety of standing armies in all parts of England, and the trial and beheading of an anointed sovereign. Think what that would have meant in those days. They all took their toll. So how did Harrington, chewing on his quill pen, propose to create a permanent and stable England? Contrary to Machiavelli, whom Harrington admired and whose premise was that all governments degenerate and that every so often you need a violent purge, which is what had just happened in the Civil War, to restore the state to a vigorous and stable condition. Harrington maintained that only a commonwealth or republic can produce this sort of stability. And he said domestic empire is founded upon dominion. Dominion is property, real or personal. That is to say, in lands or in money or goods. Land confers political power. The more diffused that power was through distribution of land throughout the population, the more power the people had. And conversely, the more it was concentrated in the hands of a group of top dogs, whether aristocracy or oligarchy or monarch, the more powerful they would become. The best regime was the one with an equitable division of land, which would distribute power among people in such a way that no one would have any interest in changing the regime. No rebellions, no bloody civil wars. Political power would also be diffused or shared through office holding, with all political positions being filled by men chosen by ballot and for a limited term. In other words, a type of democracy. Now, the best way of dividing the real estate of a country or a nation was one that would be permanent, in which there would be no transfer of land, and thus power, by or to unscrupulous developers, no sale resulting in a monopoly of power. Like all educated men of his time, Harrington was familiar with the Hebrew Bible, and thus with the Jewish agrarian laws as set forth in the Torah. This, he was convinced, was the way to go. This kind of law, fixing the balance of lands, is called agrarian, and was first introduced by God himself, who divided the land of Canaan to his people by lots, and is of such virtue that whenever it has held, that government has not altered, except by consent, as in that unparalleled example of the people of Israel, when being in liberty, they would needs choose a king. But without agrarian law, government, whether monarchical, aristocratical, or popular, has no long lease. Moses, acting for God, seemed to have instituted a peaceful way to restore the vitality necessary for a permanent state, restoring all lands to the original owners, the original tribe, every 50 years. This law of Jubilee meant that the land was never really sold, because the true owner was God himself, only leased, and therefore could never be concentrated in the hands of a few. In a one-page proposal addressed to Cromwell in 1656, Harrington outlined a plan that would have tested his theory of how to create a permanent state free from the dangers of internal degeneration and insurrection. He hoped, despite his identification with the late king, to obtain employment as a political advisor or consultant. His proposal: to lease Ireland in perpetuity to the Jews, with the country divided up as in the days of old in Canaan, having of course removed the Anglo Irish landlords. This was going to solve two perennial problems in one go for the English. The first thorn in England's side we've already touched on in mentioning the 1641 rebellion of the Catholic Federation, which was loosely aligned with the Royalists in England and Scotland. The presence of this troublesome colony, permanently simmering with disaffection, that boiled over at intervals into open insurrection, was a permanent threat to England of invasion by the back door and a continual drain on the English economy. But why involve the Jews? They were, as ever, in need of a permanent home. In 1290, Edward I had banished the English Jews from his kingdom, helping himself to their non-portable property while he was at it. In 1655, Cromwell, motivated possibly by his liberal stance on the existing unofficial Jewish presence in Britain, but certainly desirous of reaping the financial benefits. Sorry, we'll hold the financial benefits. The unofficial presence in those days were a small number of Sephardic Jews who'd been escaping from their most Catholic majesties, Ferdinand and Isabella, having been expelled from Spain. And they'd gone to Amsterdam and then come to England. But they called themselves Spaniards. They weren't officially there as Jews, and they didn't have the right to create synagogues or cemeteries. So Cromwell was well disposed towards this population, but also he knew that there'd be great financial benefits, that a return of a mercantile Jewish population in numbers would accrue to a nearly bankrupt England after all the wars. And under pressure from the passionate and persistent advocate Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel of Amsterdam. And also there was a kind of ideological take on this, because he was very keen that all the countries in the world had their quota of Jewish folk in them to hasten the coming of Messiah. So he kind of had a two-pronged attack there. So a petition was submitted to the Council of State to allow Jews to immigrate to England officially and with civil rights. Now, this Whitehall conference in December of 1655 didn't succeed in coming to any conclusion apart from refusing Cromwell's request for Jewish naturalization. So Cromwell issued a verbal promise backed by the Council of State to allow Jews to return and practice their faith freely, including creating synagogues and cemeteries. So, no doubt, Harrington thought his proposal would appeal to Cromwell on two accounts. Under industrious Jewish control, Ireland would become a peaceful and prosperous nation, and the Jews would have their own forever home and bother the Gentile world no more. How was this to be accomplished? Well, Ireland, according to Harrington, had two great natural advantages. It was a fertile country, and it had numerous and good ports. But it had a great drawback, which was the presence of a native, quote, slothful and pusillanimous population. Lazy Irish. So to replace these people with the Jews was a great idea. And of course, they would make excellent husbandmen. After all, they'd spent all those years in Canaan farming, hadn't they? Despite the fact that it had been 1,500 years since they'd owned a foot of land or planted a potato. So their mercantile skills and experience would be used to export the produce of their labours, and Ireland would be an asset to the English instead of a burden. And it's a bit naughty of me to suggest that in all of this, in the preparation, which I thoroughly enjoyed, with regard to Harrington's vision, all I could see was hobbits, you know, happy hobbits with lovely green fields, sitting on fences, smoking pipes, you know, it was all going to be really idyllic. Anyway, it didn't happen. So how is this going to work out to the Jewish financial advantage, the British financial advantage? Ireland's Jewish tenants would pay an annual rent of £4 million every year for 7 years, which I think sounds like a huge amount of money. And then, after that, oh yes, the reason it was so high, the rent, was that English were going to have a military presence. A large part of these monies were going to go in those 7 years to providing military protection. Well, you can imagine if you were an Anglo Irish landlord sitting, swilling whatever it was you swilled in those days, and a whole load of hairy-footed Hobbit/Jews arrived and wanted to turf you out, you wouldn't be too happy. After 7 years, the rent was going to be reduced to £2 million. per annum, with Ireland raising and paying its own army. Harrington's vision of a Jewish Ireland populated by prosperous farmers who had reinstated the Jewish agrarian laws and dignified merchants was a refreshing reversal of the stereotypical view of the Shylock evil moneylender or the poor pushy peddler. Needless to say, Cromwell didn't agree to Harrington's proposal, and the Jews in England remained homeless, aliens, still yearning for Jerusalem. Now we go on to another part. The next attempt to integrate British Jews as full citizens also backfired. Although passed by a vote of 96 to 52, the Jewish in the House of Commons, the Jewish Naturalization Act in 1753 was repealed the following year for reasons of so-called political necessity, because it stirred up a huge amount of anti-feeling. So what was the social and political context of this failure? Well, the received public image of the Jew in the 18th century, as given in the literature of the day, and this was the age of the coffee house, of satire and the pamphlet, was still largely that of the figure of Shylock from 200 years previously. In written texts, Jews were called dogs, cursed, malicious, traitor. That's our friend Daniel Defoe. Alexander Pope, who wrote a lot of satirical stuff, wrote a short piece, a satire about an English Christian who falls into the hands of the Jews because he likes money too much. And at the end of this little piece, there's a great small prayer. Keep us, we beseech thee, from the hands of such barbarous and cruel Jews, who, albeit they abhor the blood of black puddings, yet thirst they vehemently after the blood of the white ones. Blood libel, and that we may avoid such like calamities, may all good and well-disposed Christians be warned by this unhappy wretch's woeful example to abominate the heinous sin of avarice. Novelists Sterne, Smollett, Fanny Burney, dramatists Sheridan, Colley Cibber, Granville, and many others also had a very powerful and detrimental effect. This unrelievedly negative picture of Britain's Jewish population wasn't helped by an influx in the latter part of the 17th century, the 1600s, of German and Polish Jews, mostly peddlers and petty tradesmen, many from the Rhineland, displaced by the horrors of the 30 Years' War. And that is a subject in itself. I can tell you, if you think there have been horrible wars, that one was just simply indescribable. There were an estimated 20,000 Jews living in Britain by the end of the century. The evil Jew stereotype was also confirmed by the numbers of aristocrats with mortgaged estates. Now, I can't even remember where I got the statistic, and I haven't checked it properly, but they're saying that by the mid-18th century, 3/4 of the great landowners had mortgaged their estates, and I think it was to do with agricultural issues with the land values going down, because there were periodic times when there were problems agriculturally.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
I based this on the Market the Sad book I read, but apparently after the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War, like the power of the aristocrats was almost permanently broken by kind of a new kind of opportunistic post-war character, middle class, or kind of middle class who took advantage of
Sort of carpetbaggers.
Carpetbaggers, that's
Yeah.
exactly. And Market the Sad, who was an aristocrat at the time, wrote a satirical book, 100 Days of Sodom, where the villainous characters are of this class, which he's all aristocratic class would have hated. Is kind of
Upstart.
Upstart with Irish types who took advantage of it. So I think the idea of kind of large landowners were kind of replaced by this. Is that? Would that affect, say, Cromwell or this James Harrington character's view?
Well, I think the point is they lingered on, whether there was an actual change of ownership. But, and again, I'm sorry, I don't have a statistic with me, but there's an overwhelming percentage of land remaining in the hands of a very small percentage of the population right up until the late 19th century. So, although I'm sure what you're saying is absolutely true, I think, I suppose that's always true in the aftermath of any disruption, isn't it? You'll get the opportunists.
I think the land before that land was controlled by kind of absolutists.
Yes.
Who almost had a religious reason to control land. Now they're replaced by more secular, hard-nosed types who basically took advantage of a war
Right.
and profited from it. Similar to the American Civil War. Indeed, any major war which disrupts a country, you're going to get kind of...
Clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Harrington's point, that was his point, that, you know, if land is distributed equitably, thank you,
Yes.
you don't get the upheavals, you know, it's much less likely. But anyway, that's for another day, but thank you for that. Now, where was I? Okay, we were talking about landlords. Okay, the controversy over naturalisation that had started with Cromwell's attempt to officially incorporate Jews into British society rumbled on, with the Jews themselves joining in the sometimes vitriolic exchange via pamphlet and essay. For example, in 1714, there was published by a Jewish author, The Reasons for Naturalising the Jews of Great Britain and Ireland on the same foot with all the other nations. So you get something like this published, and then you get a whole horde of Christian pamphleteers, you know, saying, no, no, no. You know, it's actually, I suppose, the equivalent of social media in those days was done by pamphlet and essay. Okay, so this goes on until 1753, when Henry Pelham, the Whig Prime Minister of the day, partly as a reward for Jewish support of the government in 1745 Jacobite rebellion, introduced this bill for the naturalisation of the Jewish people in Britain. But there was such an uproar that the bill was repealed in 1754. Now, I'm not going to get into that anymore, but although there was a positive result as far as the Jewish community was concerned, in that they decided, having failed to get this bill through, that they would have a more active approach to political life with the creation of the Committee of Deputies of British Jews in 1760. But there was a downside. Many leading Sephardic families converted or gave up active participation in Jewish affairs because escalating assimilation was hardly surprising for them, as the failure of the 1753 Act limited their increasing social and political aspirations. They were rich, they were civilized, they were okay, but they wanted a slice of the action. They wanted, quite rightly, to participate in the political life of the day. And of course, the professions still remained closed to them. Now, we have one wonderful example, I'm sure many of you know of him, Samson Gideon, who lived the first half of the 18th century, and he had raised loans to support the British government, and he'd averted a run on the Bank of England, so his credentials were extremely good as someone who should have had some influence. Now, he remained in the Jewish faith, but his son, Sam Jr., converted, was baptized, went to Eton, as one does, became a baronet in 1759, and then Baron, is it Eardley or Eardsley? Does anyone know? I think I've got an S where it doesn't belong. Anyone know? Okay. Baron Eardley, or Eardsley, of Spalding in 1789. Now, this trend to assimilate worried the chief rabbi of Britain of that day. He was only chief rabbi for a short number of years, from 1758 to 1764, Hart Lyon, who identified beard shaving, theatre and opera going, card playing in coffee houses, sending children to Christian schools, as all making the community more like the Gentiles. They were becoming ger toshav, settled strangers. Oh, how we long. The latter half of the 18th and the 19th century were the era of Jewish emancipation. Barriers of prejudice and misunderstanding were gradually falling. Journals, pamphlets, and periodicals all reflected an interest in the burgeoning Jewish population as a topic for discussion. In one single issue of a monthly magazine, whose name I neglected to put in my notes, in 1810, there are no fewer than 7 articles on Jewish subjects, and various Jewish histories were also published. Now, possibly the most famous essay in favor of the Jewish inclusion into British society was William Hazlitt's Emancipation of the Jews in 1830, published in the Tatler, a vigorous and reasoned attack on Tory bigotry, possibly influenced in turn by an 1829 pamphlet by Francis Henry Goldschmidt. But I encourage you all, I had a wonderful chunk of this to read out to you, but it would have made this far too long. It is the most beautifully written, marvelously reasoned, superb piece of writing. Look it up, read it, it's great. Now, we won't go through all the bits and pieces of this long road to emancipation, but I just want to hit 4 or 5 dates and things. Okay, so big thing, 1829, the Test and Corporation Acts were repealed, and this led to Catholic emancipation. Now, the Test and Corporation Acts were based on the fact that you couldn't hold office of any kind, municipal office, unless you swore an oath as a good Christian, and you also had to kind of prove that you were that by taking communion in the Anglican tradition. And so that was repealed. In 1831, trade restrictions preventing Jews from opening a shop within the city of London were lifted. Oh, now before this, something happened that I thought was really encouraging, and it's something that happened in Dublin. How many years ago did we demonstrate for Sharansky's release? Well, in 1828, Jews and Christians together joined in a mass meeting in London to protest the brutality of persecution of Jews by the Russian government. Wasn't that encouraging all those years ago? The beginning of the Reform Acts, 1832, reforming who could vote, suffrage. Another little one that was a lovely straw in the wind. In 1837, one of the first public acts of Queen Victoria was to knight Sir Moses Montefiore, Sheriff of the City of London, and he was able to take up that post because of the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts. But people didn't get to Parliament yet. Okay. By 1846, only Parliament itself was still closed to Jews. In 1847 and 49, Lionel de Rothschild was elected for the City of London, but couldn't take his seat because of the oath. 1850, David Salomons elected for Greenwich, and he was much more bold. He went and took his seat and created a great brouhaha. He was fined and had to pay £500 per person per vote. I can't, it was incredible. At any rate, he was chucked out. So in 1858, we finally get to the Jewish Relief Act, that Jews can omit the words on the faith of a true Christian, and so they could take up seats in Parliament. And someone please help me, because again I've forgotten to write it down. Was it Rothschild or was it someone else who was the first one to... Disraeli? Was it Disraeli?
No, Disraeli wasn't Jewish.
No, exactly, he didn't count anyway.
I think it was Rothschild.
I think it was Rothschild. I'm very sorry about that. Failure, mea culpa. Okay.